Baby saw a bear. Cub stuck in an apartment building mailbox. What baby did next change lives? The morning started like any other in the quiet apartment building on Maple Street. Ethan Marshall pushed his daughter Lily's stroller through the lobby, the wheels making soft clicking sounds against the marble floor. It was early, maybe 6:30, and the building was still wrapped in that special kind of silence that comes before the world fully wakes up. Lily was babbling softly to herself, her tiny hands reaching out to grab at dust particles floating in the morning sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. She was only 18 months old, but she had this way of noticing things that adults would walk right past. That morning, she noticed something that would change everything. The mailboxes stood against the wall like they always did, rows and rows of brass-fronted compartments that held bills and letters and the occasional package slip. But something was different. Lily's babbling stopped suddenly, and she pointed with her chubby finger, making a sound that was somewhere between surprise and delight. Ethan followed her gaze and froze. There, stuffed impossibly into one of the larger mailbox slots near the bottom row, was what looked like fur. Dark brown fur that was moving slightly, breathing. At first, Ethan thought maybe someone's cat had gotten stuck, but as he bent down closer, his heart nearly stopped. It wasn't a cat at all. It was a bear cub, no bigger than a small dog, wedged into the metal compartment with its head turned sideways and its eyes closed. The rational part of Ethan's mind was screaming questions. How did a bear cub get into an apartment building in the middle of the city? How did it fit into a mailbox? Why wasn't it making any noise? But the father in him, the part that had learned to respond to Lily's needs without thinking, took over. The cub was breathing shallowly, its small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed too slow. Ethan could see that one of its paws was twisted at an odd angle, caught on something inside the mailbox. Very gently, he reached out and touched the fur. It was softer than he expected, warm and alive under his fingers. The cub's eyes opened then, and Ethan found himself looking into eyes that were impossibly calm, almost intelligent. They weren't the wild, frightened eyes of a trapped animal. They were patient, waiting, as if the cub knew help would come. Lily made a cooing sound from her stroller, the same sound she made when she saw puppies in the park. She reached out her arms toward the cub, and something extraordinary happened. The cub, despite being trapped and presumably in pain, made a soft huffing sound that almost sounded like purring. It was trying to comfort the baby. Ethan's hands were shaking as he examined the mailbox more closely. The lock had been broken, probably by kids playing a prank, and the door was bent inward. Somehow, the cub had squeezed itself in, but couldn't get back out. The metal edges were pressing into its fur, and Ethan could see small spots of blood where the sharp corners had cut into the soft skin. He pulled out his phone to call animal control, but something stopped him. The cub's eyes were fixed on his, and there was something in that gaze that made him pause. It wasn't fear he saw there. It was trust. Complete, absolute trust. Ethan had seen that look before, in Lily's eyes when she was first born, when she depended on him for everything. He put the phone away and studied the situation more carefully. The mailbox door was bent but not broken. If he could just bend it back enough, maybe the cub could squeeze out. He looked around the empty lobby. The building super wouldn't be in for another hour, and calling for help would mean the cub would be taken away, probably to a zoo or worse. Something told him that wasn't supposed to happen. Working carefully, Ethan began to bend the metal door. It was harder than he thought it would be, and his fingers started to ache from the effort. The cub watched him work, never making a sound except for that soft huffing whenever Lily babbled at it. It was the strangest thing. The baby and the bear seemed to be having a conversation that Ethan couldn't understand. Lily would make her baby sounds, and the cub would respond with gentle huffs and soft eye blinks. At one point, Lily laughed, that pure, delighted laugh that only babies can make, and the cub's mouth opened in what looked impossibly like a smile. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, Ethan managed to bend the door enough to create a gap. The cub immediately began to wiggle, using its good paw to push against the inside of the mailbox. Ethan reached in to help, his hands sliding under the warm, furry body. The cub was heavier than it looked, solid and real in a way that made this whole situation even more surreal. As he lifted, the cub's injured paw came free with a small pop. And suddenly, Ethan was holding a bear cub in the lobby of his apartment building while his baby daughter clapped her hands in delight. The cub didn't struggle or try to run. It sat in Ethan's arms like it belonged there, its injured paw held carefully against its chest. Up close, Ethan could see things that didn't make sense. The cub's fur had an unusual sheen to it, almost iridescent in the morning light. Its eyes weren't the dark brown or black he expected, but a deep amber color with flecks of gold that seemed to move and shift. And there was a mark on its forehead, barely visible under the fur, that looked like a perfect circle with intricate patterns inside it. It wasn't a natural marking. It looked almost like it had been drawn there, but the lines were under the fur, part of the skin itself. Lily was reaching for the cub again, making grabbing motions with her hands. Ethan knew he should keep them apart. Wild animals were dangerous, even small ones. But this didn't feel wild. It felt like something else entirely. Carefully, he knelt down next to the stroller, still holding the cub. Lily immediately reached out and touched its fur, her tiny fingers gentle and curious. The cub turned its head and nuzzled her hand, making that purring sound again. For a moment, the three of them existed in a bubble of perfect calm. The morning sun painted golden squares on the marble floor. Dust motes danced in the air, and a baby, a man, and a bear, cub, shared a moment of connection that transcended species and logic. Then the cub moved. It wiggled out of Ethan's arms with surprising grace, landing on 3 paws while keeping the injured one raised. It looked at Ethan, then at Lily, and then toward the stairwell. It took a few limping steps, stopped, and looked back. The message was clear. It wanted them to follow. Ethan knew he should pick up Lily and go back to their apartment. He should call someone, report this, do the responsible thing. But Lily was laughing again, pointing at the cub and babbling excitedly, and the cub was waiting, patient and calm, like it had all the time in the world. Against every bit of common sense he had, Ethan picked up Lily from her stroller and followed the bear cub to the stairwell. The cub moved slowly, accommodating its injured paw, and Ethan noticed it kept looking back to make sure they were following. It didn't go down toward the exit, as Ethan expected. Instead, it started climbing up. One step at a time, pausing frequently to rest, the cub led them higher and higher, 3rd floor, 4th floor, 5th floor. Ethan's arms were getting tired from carrying Lily, but she was enchanted, her eyes never leaving the small brown form ahead of them. On the 7th floor, the cub stopped. It sat down in front of a door that Ethan had never noticed before. It was smaller than the apartment doors, painted the same beige as the walls, so it blended in almost perfectly. There was no number, no nameplate, just a small handle that looked old and worn. The cub looked at the door, then at Ethan, then back at the door. Lily made a questioning sound, and the cub responded with a soft huff. Ethan reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily in his hand. The door swung open silently, revealing a narrow staircase that led up into darkness. The cub started up these new stairs without hesitation. Ethan followed, ducking slightly to fit through the doorway. The stairs were older than the rest of the building, made of wood that creaked softly under his feet. There was a smell here, not unpleasant, but unusual. It was like pine trees and rain and something else. Something that reminded Ethan of the astronomy museum he'd visited as a child. That particular scent of old meteorites and space dust. The stairs curved as they climbed, and Ethan realized they were in some kind of tower or turret that he'd never noticed from outside the building. Light began to filter down from above, growing stronger with each step. The cub's pace quickened despite its injury, and Lily started bouncing in Ethan's arms, excited by something she could sense but not see. They emerged onto a rooftop garden that shouldn't have existed. Ethan had lived in this building for 3 years. He'd been on the roof before. It was just a flat expanse of tar and air conditioning units. But this was different. This was impossible. The garden stretched out before them, larger than the building itself should have allowed. There were trees here, actual trees with thick trunks and spreading branches. Flowers bloomed in carefully tended beds, their colors more vivid than anything Ethan had seen before. The morning sun seemed softer here, filtered through leaves that rustled in a breeze Ethan couldn't feel. And there, in the center of it all, sitting on a bench that looked like it was carved from a single piece of wood, was a woman. She wasn't old, but she wasn't young either. Her hair was the same color as the cub's fur, dark brown with those strange iridescent highlights. She wore a simple dress that seemed to shift colors as she moved, sometimes green, sometimes brown, sometimes a blue so deep it was almost black. When she looked up at them, Ethan saw she had the same amber eyes as the cub, with the same golden flecks that moved like living things. She smiled, and it was the warmest, most welcoming smile Ethan had ever seen. The cub limped over to her and sat at her feet, looking up at her with what could only be described as love. She reached down and touched its injured paw, and Ethan watched in amazement as the angle straightened, the cuts closed, and the cub put its paw down firmly on the ground. It wasn't dramatic or flashy, it was as simple and natural as breathing. The woman stood and walked toward them, her movements graceful and unhurried. When she spoke, her voice had an accent Ethan couldn't place, musical and soft. She thanked him for helping her child. That's what she called the cub, her child. She said she'd been waiting for someone like him, someone who would help without question, without fear. She said Lily was special, that she could see things others couldn't, feel things others had forgotten how to feel. She said the cub had chosen them, had known they would be the ones to help. Ethan wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Who was she? What was this place? How was any of this possible? But Lily was reaching for the woman, making happy sounds. And when the woman took her in her arms, Lily settled against her like she'd known her all her life. The woman told them a story then, sitting on the bench with Lily in her lap and the cub at her feet. She spoke of places between places, spaces that existed in the margins of the world. She said there had always been those who could move between these spaces, who kept the balance between what was seen and unseen. The cub was learning, she said. It had ventured too far, gotten curious about the human world, and gotten stuck. But it had chosen its moment and its rescuers wisely. She said Ethan and Lily were part of something now, something ancient and gentle and important. As she spoke, Ethan noticed other things in the garden, shadows that moved independently of their sources. Flowers that turned to follow Lily's gaze, birds that landed on the woman's shoulders and seemed to whisper in her ears. It should have been frightening, but it wasn't. It was peaceful, like finding a room in your house you'd never noticed before. A room that had always been there, waiting for you to need it. The woman said they could visit whenever they wanted. The door would be there for them, visible only to them. The garden would be a safe place, a quiet place. A place where Lily could grow up understanding that the world was bigger and more wonderful than most people knew. She handed Lily back to Ethan, and the baby yawned, suddenly sleepy. The cub stood and walked over to them, no trace of its injury remaining. It reached up and touched Lily's hand with its nose, a gesture of farewell and promise. Then it walked back to the woman, and they both began to fade. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gently, like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. The garden remained, but it was empty now, peaceful and waiting. Ethan stood there for a long time, holding his sleeping daughter, trying to process what had happened. The sun climbed higher, warming his face. The garden was real. He could touch the trees, smell the flowers, feel the bench under his fingers. But when he finally made his way back down the strange stairs and through the hidden door, he found himself in a hallway that looked different. The door was still there, but now it looked like it belonged, like it had always been there. He knew without checking that no one else would see it the way he did. Back in their apartment, Ethan put Lily down for her morning nap. She slept peacefully, a small smile on her face, her hand clutching something. When Ethan looked closer, he saw it was a single hair, long and brown with an iridescent sheen. A gift from the cub. A reminder that it had all been real. He sat by her crib for a long time, watching her sleep, thinking about the morning's events. His phone buzzed with messages from work, from friends, from the normal world that suddenly seemed less solid than it had before. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself checking the hallway every time he passed the 7th floor. The door was always there, always visible to him, but he didn't go through it again. Not yet. He was still processing, still trying to understand what it meant. But Lily knew. Even though she couldn't talk yet, she knew. She would point at the ceiling sometimes and laugh, as if she could see through the floors to the garden above. She would make the same huffing sound the cub had made, and Ethan would find himself smiling without knowing why. A week passed before they went back. Ethan had been having dreams, gentle dreams of forests and stars, and connections he couldn't quite grasp. Lily had been restless, not unhappy but eager, like she was waiting for something. So, on a quiet Sunday morning, Ethan bundled her up and carried her to the 7th floor. The door opened at his touch, the stairs welcomed their feet, and the garden bloomed before them, more beautiful than before. The woman wasn't there, but the cub was. It had grown slightly, its fur thicker and more lustrous. It ran to them with obvious joy, careful not to knock Lily over with its enthusiasm. They spent the morning in the garden, Lily crawling through the grass while the cub followed protectively. Ethan found a book on the bench, written in a language he didn't recognize but could somehow understand. It told stories of the in-between places, of the guardians who moved through both worlds, of the children who could see beyond the veil. As he read, he began to understand that this wasn't just about him and Lily. There were others like them, scattered throughout the city, throughout the world. People who had been chosen or had chosen themselves to be bridges between worlds. The woman and her cub were teachers, guides, protectors of sorts. They helped maintain the balance, kept the magic from overwhelming the mundane, kept the mundane from crushing the magic. And now Ethan and Lily were part of that network, that gentle conspiracy of wonder. The cub showed them things that morning. It led them to a pool of water that reflected not the sky above but other skies, other gardens, other places where the boundaries were thin. Lily laughed and splashed, and in the ripples, Ethan saw glimpses of their future. He saw Lily growing up with one foot in each world, saw her bringing others to the garden, saw her teaching her own children about the spaces between spaces. He saw himself, older but not aged, still guardian of the door, still protector of the secret. When they left that day, the cub followed them down the stairs. At the door to the 7th floor hallway, it stopped and looked at them with those intelligent amber eyes. Then it did something that made Ethan's breath catch. It spoke, not with a human voice, but directly into their minds, a communication of pure feeling and intent. It said its name, though it wasn't a name that could be written or spoken. It said it would grow with Lily, be her friend and protector, her connection to the wider, wilder world. It said the mailbox had been a test, and they had passed. Back in their apartment, life continued. Ethan went to work, paid bills, did laundry. But everything was different now. Colors seemed brighter, sounds had more depth, and sometimes out of the corner of his eye he would see things that weren't quite there. Or maybe they were there, and he was just finally able to see them. Lily grew and developed faster than the pediatrician expected, but not in any way that caused concern. She was just more aware, more connected, more present than other children her age. The visits to the garden became a regular part of their routine. Sometimes the woman was there, teaching Ethan about the plants that grew in both worlds, showing him how to see the connections between things. Sometimes it was just the cub, growing larger and more magnificent with each passing week. And sometimes the garden was empty except for them, a peaceful sanctuary where they could just be, without questions or explanations. One day, about a month after the first encounter, Ethan found another parent in the hallway of the 7th floor. Jessica Brooks, a single mother from the 4th floor, was standing at the hidden door with her son Connor, who was just a few months older than Lily. She looked at Ethan with a mixture of relief and confusion. Connor had been drawing pictures, she said, of a garden in the sky and a bear that wasn't a bear. He'd led her here, insisted the door was there even though she couldn't see it at first. But then she'd touched it, and suddenly she could. Ethan smiled and opened the door for them. Connor ran up the stairs without hesitation, and they could hear his delighted laughter echoing down. Jessica looked at Ethan with tears in her eyes. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when you realize you're not alone in something wonderful and strange. They climbed the stairs together, and at the top, they found Connor and Lily playing with the cub, who had somehow split into two, one for each child. Or maybe there had always been two. In this place, such things didn't need logical explanations. The woman appeared then, materializing from the space between two trees. She welcomed Jessica with the same warm smile she'd given Ethan. She explained that the building had been chosen long ago as a convergence point, a place where the walls between worlds were naturally thin. Those who lived here were selected, though they didn't know it, for their capacity to accept wonder, their ability to bridge differences, their potential to protect and nurture the magic that still existed in the world. As the weeks turned to months, more residents found their way to the garden. Logan Carter, an elderly man from the 2nd floor who'd been dreaming of his deceased wife, found her waiting for him among the flowers. Not alive again, but not gone either, existing in the space between memory and presence. Avery Johnson, a teenager struggling with feeling different from everyone around her, discovered that different was exactly what the garden needed, that her unique perspective could see patterns others missed. Each person brought something to the garden, and each took something away. The cubs multiplied or divided, or simply existed in whatever number was needed. The woman was sometimes one, sometimes many, sometimes just a voice in the wind. The garden itself grew and changed, reflecting the needs and dreams of those who visited it. It became a place of healing for some, a place of learning for others, and for all of them, a reminder that reality was far more flexible and forgiving than they'd been taught. Ethan watched Lily grow in this dual world. She learned to walk in the garden, her first steps supported by the cub who had become her constant companion in that space. Her first word wasn't mama or dada, but something in that unpronounceable language of the in-between, a word that meant connection and joy, and the feeling of sunlight through leaves. She moved between the regular world and the garden world with an ease that Ethan envied, never questioning, never doubting, simply accepting both as equally real and valid. The mailbox where it had all started became a shrine of sorts. Ethan would sometimes find small offerings left there, flowers that didn't exist in normal gardens, stones that hummed with subtle energy, drawings from the children who visited the garden. The building's superintendent, a practical man named Michael Hayes, never seemed to notice these things, his eyes sliding over them as if they weren't there. But once, Ethan saw him pause at the mailbox, his hand hovering over it, a confused expression on his face as if he was trying to remember something important. One evening, almost 6 months after the first encounter, Ethan was putting Lily to bed when she spoke in clear, perfect sentences for the first time. She told him that the cub had a message. The garden was going to change soon, grow beyond the building, spread to other places that needed it. She and Ethan were going to be ambassadors, helping others find their own doors, their own gardens, their own cubs. She said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing what to have for breakfast, then yawned and fell asleep. That night, Ethan dreamed he was flying over the city, and everywhere he looked, he could see points of light, hidden doors and secret gardens, rooftop sanctuaries and basement groves. He saw the network spreading, not aggressively but gently, like morning glory vines finding their way up a wall. He saw children and adults, humans and creatures that weren't quite human, all connected by threads of light and purpose. He saw the woman and the cub revealed in their true forms as beings of pure energy and intent, shepherds of wonder in a world that had almost forgotten how to wonder. When he woke, he found a note on his nightstand written in handwriting he didn't recognize. It was an address across town and a time 3 days hence. Nothing more. But he knew what it meant. The network was calling, asking him to help someone else find their door. He looked at Lily, sleeping peacefully in her crib, the cub's hair still clutched in her tiny fist, and felt a surge of purpose unlike anything he'd experienced before. This was their work now, their calling, their gift to a world that desperately needed to remember magic. 3 days later, Ethan stood outside a rundown apartment building on the other side of the city. Lily was with Jessica, who had become a close friend and fellow guardian of the secret. He waited, not sure what he was waiting for, until he saw her. Savannah Reed, a young woman with tired eyes and a baby carrier strapped to her chest. She was struggling with groceries and keys, and her baby was crying. Ethan stepped forward to help, and as their hands touched over the grocery bags, he felt it. That spark of recognition, that potential for wonder. He helped her inside, making small talk about babies and buildings. As they waited for the elevator, her baby suddenly stopped crying and pointed at something only it could see. Savannah laughed tiredly and said the baby had been doing that a lot lately, pointing at nothing, laughing at empty air. Ethan smiled and said, maybe it wasn't nothing. Maybe babies could see things adults had forgotten how to see. She looked at him strangely, but there was hope in that look, a desperate need to believe in something beyond the grinding routine of survival. He told her about his building, about how sometimes the most wonderful things were hidden in the most ordinary places. He gave her the address and said if she ever wanted to visit, there was a playdate group that met regularly. Nothing formal, just parents and kids who understood that the world was bigger than it seemed. She took the information with a skeptical but intrigued expression. As Ethan left, he heard her baby laugh again, and when he looked back, he could swear he saw a shimmer in the air near them, like heat waves, but more purposeful. A week later, Savannah showed up at the building with her baby, Haley. Jessica met them at the door and brought them up to Ethan's apartment, where Lily was playing with blocks that sometimes stacked themselves when no one was looking. The babies recognized each other immediately, reaching out with the instant friendship that only children possess. Savannah watched with amazement as Lily showed Haley how to make the blocks glow by touching them in a certain pattern. They didn't take her to the garden that first day. These things had to happen naturally, couldn't be forced. But over the next few weeks, Savannah became a regular visitor. She relaxed in a way she hadn't in months, finding in Ethan and Jessica and the others a community that accepted the strange and wonderful without question. And then, one day, Haley led her mother to the 7th floor, babbling excitedly about something only she could see. The door revealed itself, and Savannah gasped as she finally saw what had been there all along. The garden welcomed them as it welcomed everyone who was meant to find it. The cub appeared, now large enough that the babies could ride on its back. Gentle as a lamb despite its growing size. The woman emerged from her tree shadow and embraced Savannah like an old friend returning home. And in that moment, the network grew stronger, another link in the chain of wonder that was slowly, gently, surrounding the world with magic. As autumn approached, the garden began to show them new things. The trees dropped leaves that turned into butterflies before they hit the ground. The pool of water became a window to other gardens in other cities, and they could wave to children and parents they'd never met but somehow knew. The cub began to teach the older children, showing them how to move between spaces, how to see the connections, how to tend the magic without trying to control it. Ethan documented everything in a journal that wrote itself in multiple languages simultaneously. He didn't know who would read it or when, but he felt compelled to record these experiences, to leave a trail for others to follow. The woman told him that throughout history, there had been such chroniclers, people who kept the stories alive even when the world forgot to believe in them. She showed him a library hidden in the garden, filled with thousands of such journals, each one a testament to the persistence of wonder. One particularly memorable day, the cub fell ill. Not seriously, but enough that it lay listlessly in the garden, its usual energy dimmed. The children were distraught, especially Lily, who had never seen her friend anything but vibrant and playful. The woman explained that even magical beings needed care and rest, that the cub had been working hard to maintain the connections, to help the network grow. She taught the children how to help, showing them how to sing the old songs that strengthened the bonds between worlds. As the children sang, their voices high and pure, something extraordinary happened. Other cubs appeared, dozens of them, all slightly different but all family. They surrounded their sibling, adding their voices to the song in harmonies that human ears could barely perceive. The garden itself seemed to pulse with life, flowers blooming brighter, trees standing taller. And slowly, gradually, the sick cub began to improve, its eyes brightening, its fur regaining its iridescent sheen. That evening, as Ethan carried a sleeping Lily back to their apartment, he realized that this was just the beginning. The woman had told him that the cubs were young members of an ancient species, beings that had always existed alongside humanity, helping to maintain the balance between the mundane and the magical. The fact that they were revealing themselves now, that the gardens were multiplying, meant something significant was happening. The world was ready to remember, ready to believe again. The first snow of winter brought new revelations. The garden didn't disappear or become dormant as a normal garden would. Instead, it transformed into a winter wonderland that defied physics. Snow fell upward in some places, formed impossible crystalline structures in others. The cub's fur grew thicker and whiter, and it taught the children how to build snow creatures that moved on their own, temporary beings of joy and frozen breath that lasted just long enough to dance and play before melting back into possibility. It was during this time that Jacob Bennett found them. He was a contractor hired to do some work on the building's roof, and he'd stumbled upon the door by accident. Or maybe not by accident, because as the woman explained, there were no accidents in the garden, only convergences waiting to happen. Jacob had a daughter, Lily Morgan, the same age as Ethan's Lily, and he'd been having dreams about bears and impossible gardens for weeks before taking this job. The two Lilies became instant friends, and their connection seemed to strengthen the garden itself. Where they played together, new flowers grew even in the snow. When they laughed, the air shimmered with colors that didn't have names. The woman watched them with a knowing smile and told the adults that children with the same name finding each other in the garden was a sign, though she wouldn't say of what. As winter deepened, the garden became a refuge not just for those who could see it, but for those who needed it without knowing it existed. People in the building reported sleeping better, having dreams of flying and freedom. Small miracles occurred, lost things were found, old grievances were forgotten, and neighbors who hadn't spoken in years suddenly found themselves sharing coffee and conversation. The building itself seemed to hum with a subtle energy, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heating system. The cub, now nearly fully grown, began to venture outside the garden. Ethan would sometimes see it in the early morning, walking through the building's hallways like a ghost of possibility. Only those ready to see it could see it, and their reactions were always the same. A moment of shock followed by wonder, followed by an inexplicable sense of peace. It never stayed long in the regular world, but its presence left traces, small changes that made life a little more bearable, a little more magical. One night, Ethan woke to find Lily standing by the window, talking to someone he couldn't see. She was speaking in that strange language again, the one that sounded like wind chimes and running water. When he asked her who she was talking to, she said it was the cub's mother, the real one, not the woman in the garden who was more of a teacher and guide. She said the mother lived in the stars, but visited sometimes to check on her children, all of them, the cubs and the humans alike. Ethan looked out the window and saw nothing unusual at first, but then, as his eyes adjusted, he began to see patterns in the stars that hadn't been there before, or maybe had always been there but he'd never known how to look. They formed shapes that suggested massive beings of light and shadow, watching over the world with infinite patience and love. He understood then that the garden, the cubs, the woman, they were all part of something immeasurably vast and ancient, a network of care that stretched across dimensions and time. As spring arrived, the garden exploded with life. Flowers that bloomed in colors beyond the visible spectrum, trees that grew fruit which tasted different to each person who tried it, always exactly what they needed. The pool of water became more active, showing not just other gardens but other times, past and future, blending in its depths. The children who had been visiting all winter were changing too, developing abilities that would have been called supernatural if they weren't so natural to them. Lily could now speak to any animal, not just the cub. Connor could make plants grow with a touch. Haley could see the threads that connected all living things. The other Lily, Jacob's daughter, could heal small hurts with her laughter, and they all moved between the regular world and the garden world with an ease that made the adults marvel. They were becoming bridges themselves, living connections between realities. The woman began to teach the adults more actively now. She showed them how to tend the garden even when they weren't physically in it, how to carry its peace and magic into their daily lives. She taught them the history of the spaces between spaces, how they had always existed but had been forgotten as humanity became more focused on what could be measured and proved. She said the time of forgetting was ending, that the children now being born would grow up in a world where magic and science, wonder and reason could coexist. She also warned them that not everyone would understand or accept what was happening. There would be those who feared the return of magic, who would try to destroy the gardens and silence the cubs. But she said this with such calm certainty that it didn't feel like a threat, more like weather that would pass. The network was too strong now, too widespread. For every garden that might be lost, 10 more would grow. For every person who rejected wonder, a dozen would embrace it. One day, in late spring, something unprecedented happened. The superintendent, Michael Hayes, knocked on Ethan's door. He looked confused and slightly embarrassed. He said he'd been having dreams, strange dreams about a garden on the roof that couldn't possibly exist. He'd tried to ignore them, but this morning he'd found himself on the 7th floor, staring at a door he'd never noticed before. He could see it, but when he tried to touch it, his hand passed right through. He wanted to know if Ethan knew anything about it. Ethan made a decision based on instinct and the subtle nod Lily gave him. He told Michael the truth, or at least part of it. He said there was indeed something special about the building, something that revealed itself to people when they were ready. He said Michael was close to being ready, but not quite there yet. He needed to stop trying to understand it with his mind and start feeling it with his heart. Michael looked skeptical but also hopeful, a combination Ethan had learned to recognize as the beginning of transformation. Over the next few weeks, Michael began to change. He was still the practical, efficient superintendent, but there was a softness to him now, an openness. He started leaving food out for the stray cats that frequented the building, began tending to the small garden in the courtyard with unusual care, and then, one morning, Ethan saw him in the 7th floor hallway, his hand solid on the door handle, tears streaming down his face as he finally could touch what he'd been seeing. The garden embraced Michael as it embraced everyone, but his role was different. He became the guardian of the threshold, the one who helped prepare others for what they would find. He had a gift for knowing who was ready and who needed more time, who would thrive in the garden and who might be overwhelmed by it. He became the gentle gatekeeper, the first friend to those who were just beginning to see. As summer arrived in full glory, the garden revealed its greatest secret. The woman gathered all the regular visitors, adults and children alike, and led them to a part of the garden they'd never seen before. It was a grove of ancient trees, older than the building, older than the city, maybe older than human memory. In the center of the grove was a tree unlike any other, its trunk twisted into a spiral that hurt to look at directly, its branches reaching into spaces that weren't quite there. She explained that this tree was the heart of the garden, the anchor point that allowed it to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Every garden in the network had such a tree, and they were all the same tree, existing in different places at the same time. Through this tree, they could travel to any other garden instantly, could communicate with garden keepers around the world, could access the accumulated wisdom of all who had come before. She taught them how to touch the tree safely, how to open their minds to its vast consciousness without being overwhelmed. One by one, they placed their hands on the spiral trunk and gasped as they felt the network in its entirety. Thousands of gardens, millions of people, all connected by threads of intention and wonder. They saw that they were part of something that had been growing for millennia, a quiet revolution of consciousness that was finally reaching critical mass. The cub, now fully grown and magnificent, stood beside the tree like a guardian. It was no longer just a cub, but something more, a bridge being that could walk between all worlds with ease. It looked at each of them with those amber eyes, and they understood that it had been testing them, teaching them, preparing them for this moment. They were no longer just visitors to the garden. They were its keepers, its protectors, its seeds to be scattered into the world. That night, there was a celebration in the garden. Beings that Ethan had only glimpsed before appeared in full visibility. Creatures of light and shadow, of earth and air, of possibilities that physics hadn't discovered yet. They danced with the children, sang songs that rearranged the stars, told stories that became real as they were spoken. It was beautiful and overwhelming and perfect. A reminder that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had dared to imagine. As the evening wore on, the woman took Ethan aside. She told him that his role was about to change. Lily was growing into her power faster than expected, and she would need guidance that went beyond what the garden could provide. There were others like her, children who were born to be bridges, and they needed to find each other. She gave him a map that wasn't quite a map, more like a living document that showed where these children were as they became ready to be found. The next phase of their journey began the following week. Using the map and the tree's network, Ethan and Lily began to travel. Not physically at first, but through the garden's connections, visiting other gardens in other cities, meeting other families who were part of the network. Each garden was unique, reflecting the culture and needs of its location, but all were connected by the same thread of wonder and purpose. They met a boy in Tokyo, whose garden was a rooftop Zen paradise where origami cranes came to life. They met a girl in London whose garden existed in an abandoned underground station, filled with bioluminescent plants and creatures that sang in harmony with the passing trains. They met twins in Cairo, whose garden bloomed in the desert, an oasis that existed outside of time where past and future pharaohs came to rest. Each child they met had a companion like the cub, though they took different forms. Some were birds that spoke in colors, others were cats that walked through walls. Still others were beings of pure energy that looked like miniature stars. All were teachers, guides, friends to the children who would reshape the world's understanding of what was possible. As autumn returned, marking a full year since that first morning with the cub in the mailbox, Ethan reflected on how much had changed. The building was now known in certain circles as a special place, though most people couldn't say exactly why. Families with sensitive children sought out apartments there, drawn by instinct and whispered recommendations. The garden had grown beyond the rooftop, creating pocket dimensions throughout the building where magic could flourish undisturbed. Lily was 3 now, but she spoke with the wisdom of someone much older when she was in the garden. She was teaching other children, showing them how to see the connections, how to nurture the magic without trying to possess it. She and the cub were inseparable, 2 parts of a whole that moved between worlds with grace and purpose. Watching them together, Ethan understood that this had always been her destiny, that finding the cub that morning had been a moment of recognition, not discovery. The woman began to appear less frequently, though her presence could always be felt. She was needed elsewhere, she explained, as new gardens were blooming faster than ever before. The network was approaching something she called the convergence, a moment when the barriers between worlds would become so thin that everyone would be able to see what had always been there. It wouldn't happen all at once, she assured them. It would be gradual, gentle, like dawn breaking over a sleeping world. She left them with gifts before her final departure. For Ethan, a journal that would always have empty pages no matter how much he wrote, and ink that would preserve not just words, but feelings and experiences. For Lily, a seed from the spiral tree that would grow into her own anchor when she was ready to create her own garden. For the others, various tools and talismans that would help them in their roles as bridge builders and wonder keepers. The cub remained, of course. It was part of their family now, as essential as breathing. It had its own apartment in the building, a space that existed in several dimensions simultaneously, where it could be its full self without frightening the uninitiated. Sometimes Ethan would visit and find it in conference with others of its kind, planning and preparing for something they wouldn't quite explain. But their intentions felt benevolent, protective, like parents preparing a safe path for children to follow. Winter came again, but this time the garden was ready for it. The snow that fell was warm to the touch, each flake containing a tiny spark of starlight. The children built snow creatures that lasted for weeks, guardians that watched over the building with benevolent crystal eyes. The spiral tree grew ice branches that chimed in the wind, playing melodies that healed hearts and opened minds. It was during this second winter that the first public acknowledgement came. A news crew, investigating reports of unusual phenomena in the city, accidentally filmed the cub walking through a wall. The footage went viral before anyone could stop it, though skeptics immediately declared it fake. But for those who were ready to see, it was confirmation of what they'd always suspected. The world was bigger than they'd been told, and magic wasn't just real, it was everywhere. The building's residents handled the attention with surprising grace. Those who couldn't see the garden simply shrugged and said people were imagining things. Those who could see it became gentle gatekeepers, neither confirming nor denying, but simply suggesting that anyone who was curious should come and see for themselves. Many came, but only those who were ready found what they were looking for. As spring returned once more, Ethan noticed that Lily was beginning to fade slightly when she was in the regular world, becoming more solid and real in the garden. The woman, in one of her rare appearances, explained that this was natural for bridge children. They existed equally in both worlds, and as they grew into their power, they would learn to modulate their presence, to be fully wherever they needed to be. She also revealed that Lily and others like her were the first of a new kind of human, or perhaps a very old kind returning. They would grow up to be the teachers and healers of a world that was remembering how to see beyond the veil. They would help humanity navigate the convergence, ensuring that the return of magic enhanced rather than destroyed the structures of modern life. The cub, now massive and magnificent, began to take Lily on journeys beyond the garden. They would disappear for hours, sometimes days, though time moved differently for them. They visited the wild places where magic had never left, deep forests and ocean trenches and mountain peaks where the old powers still held sway. They learned the true names of things, the words that could reshape reality when spoken with proper intent and respect. During one such journey, they brought back a message. The mother of all cubs, the being Lily had spoken to through the window that night, was coming to visit. Not just the garden, but the physical world itself. It had been eons since she had walked the earth in her true form, but the time was right. The network was strong enough, the bridge children numerous enough, the world ready enough to remember its magical heritage. The preparation for her arrival transformed the garden into something beyond description. Every flower bloomed simultaneously, Every tree bore fruit. Every path led to everywhere and nowhere. The spiral tree grew until its branches touched the sky, creating a canopy that existed in multiple dimensions. The pool of water became a mirror that reflected not just images but souls, showing each person who looked into it their truest, most magical self. On the night of the summer solstice, she arrived. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but like the tide coming in, gradually and inevitably. First, the stars began to move, forming patterns that told stories older than language. Then the air itself became visible, streams of light and color that showed the currents of magic that had always been there. And finally, she herself appeared, though appeared was too small a word for what happened. She was vast and intimate simultaneously, a being of such profound beauty and power that looking at her directly was like trying to see all of existence at once. She was the cub and the woman and the garden and something infinitely more. She was the connection between all living things, the thread that wove reality together, the love that moved the stars and the atoms alike. And she was, impossibly and perfectly, also just a mother checking on her children. She spoke to each of them individually, though she never moved or changed. Her voice was the wind and the silence between heartbeats and the sound of galaxies being born. She thanked them for their care of her cub, for their nurturing of the garden, for their courage in bridging worlds. She told them that what they had started here would ripple out in waves, transforming not just their world, but all worlds that touched it. To Lily, she gave a special message. She said that Lily would grow up to be a keeper of the Great Threshold, the one who would help humanity through the convergence. It would not always be easy. There would be those who resisted, those who feared the return of wonder. But Lily had something special, the ability to show people that magic and mundane were not opposites but partners, that wonder and reason could dance together. As dawn broke, she began to fade, but not to leave. She was becoming part of everything. Her presence distributed through the network, strengthening every garden, every connection, every bridge between worlds. The cub, her child and messenger, glowed with new purpose. It would stay with them, growing and teaching and protecting, until the day when such protection was no longer needed, because everyone could see and defend the magic for themselves. In the days that followed, changes accelerated. People throughout the city reported strange but beautiful experiences. Gardens grew overnight in abandoned lots. Birds began singing in harmonies that hadn't been heard for centuries. Children drew pictures of things they couldn't have seen but somehow knew. The veil was thinning, and while some found it frightening, most found it wonderful, like discovering that life was even more beautiful than they'd dared to hope. The building became a teaching center of sorts. Not officially, nothing that organized, but people came to learn. They came to understand how to see with more than their eyes, how to listen with more than their ears, how to touch the magic without trying to grasp it. Ethan and the others became guides, each teaching what they'd learned in their own way. Jessica taught the language of plants. Logan taught the art of seeing between moments. Michael taught the patience of thresholds. And Lily, young as she was, taught the most important lesson of all, how to believe. As Ethan wrote in his ever-expanding journal, he realized that the story that began with a bear cub stuck in a mailbox had become something beyond any story he could have imagined. It wasn't ending, it was expanding, including more people, more places, more possibilities. The cub had been a test, yes, but also an invitation, a door opening to a world that had always been there, waiting for humanity to remember how to see it. 2 chapters of mentioned part has completed. The second year brought revelations that changed everything they thought they knew about the garden and its purpose. The cub, now grown to its full majestic size, began showing signs of transformation. Its fur would shimmer and shift, sometimes appearing to be made of starlight, other times of shadow and earth. The woman, in one of her increasingly rare visits, explained that the cub was approaching its time of choosing. It would soon decide whether to remain in the physical world as a bridge between realms or to ascend to its mother's dimension to become a guardian of a different sort. Lily was deeply affected by this news. At 4 years old, she possessed an understanding that went far beyond her years. She spent hours in the garden with the cub, their communication happening on levels that even Ethan couldn't fully perceive. Sometimes he would find them sitting together in perfect stillness, surrounded by a gentle glow that made the air itself seem alive. Other times they would be playing like any child and pet, though their games involved bending reality in ways that still made Ethan's mind reel. The map the woman had given them began showing new locations with increasing frequency. Children around the world were awakening to their abilities, and they needed guidance. Ethan started traveling physically now, taking Lily with him when possible. They visited a girl in Mumbai, whose garden existed in the gaps between raindrops during monsoon season. They met a boy in Sao Paulo who had discovered a garden that grew in the graffiti on abandoned buildings, where painted flowers became real and murals turned into portals. Each journey taught them something new about the nature of the network. It wasn't just connecting physical spaces. It was weaving together different aspects of reality itself. The gardens were nodes in a vast web of consciousness that was slowly awakening humanity to its fuller potential. And at the center of it all was the spiral tree, or rather, the infinite tree that existed as spiral trees in every garden simultaneously. During one particularly significant visit to a garden in Nairobi, where ancient baobab trees held court with spirits that had watched over the land for millennia, they met someone unexpected. It was another woman like their garden's guardian, but older, more elemental. She spoke of the time before the forgetting, when humans and magical beings lived in open harmony. She said the gardens were not new, but were returning, reclaiming spaces that had always belonged to them. She told them about the cycles, how magic ebbed and flowed through human history like tides. There had been high tides before, times when wonder was commonplace, and low tides when magic retreated to hidden places to wait. They were approaching a high tide now, she said, the highest in recorded history. This time, magic wouldn't retreat again. The bridge children would ensure that humanity learned to live with wonder as a permanent part of their reality. Back home, the building continued to evolve. Apartments would sometimes have extra rooms that hadn't been there before, spaces that opened onto pocket gardens or libraries filled with books that wrote themselves. The basement had developed a grotto where water from impossible springs had healing properties. The roof, beyond the garden, had become a landing place for beings that traveled between stars, though only a few could see them clearly. Connor had developed the ability to paint doorways that became real. His mother, Jessica, had discovered she could speak to plants in a way that made them flourish beyond natural limits. Their apartment had become a jungle of impossible beauty, where vines carried messages and flowers bloomed in response to emotions. Together, they were documenting the changes, creating an archive for future generations who would grow up in a world where such things were normal. The other Lily, Jacob's daughter, had begun showing a different kind of gift. She could see the threads that connected all things, the invisible bonds of causality and emotion that linked every action to every consequence. With practice, she was learning to pluck these threads gently, creating ripples of positive change that spread in ways no one could predict. Her father, Jacob, had discovered his own gift for building structures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating spaces that were bigger on the inside and connected to everywhere. One autumn evening, as the leaves in the garden turned colors that had no names in any human language, the cub made its decision. It gathered everyone in the grove of ancient trees and stood before the spiral tree with a dignity that made even the youngest children fall silent. Through images and feelings rather than words, it communicated its choice. It would stay, but not as they had known it. It would become something new, a permanent bridge between worlds, a living doorway that could exist in multiple places at once. The transformation was beautiful and terrible to witness. The cub's form began to shift and flow, becoming light and shadow and something in between. For a moment, it seemed to disappear entirely, and Lily cried out in loss. But then they saw it, or rather, them. The cub had become multiple beings, each slightly different, each perfectly suited to the person they chose to companion. There was still the original cub for Lily, but also new forms for each of the bridge children, guardians that were part of their soul made manifest. This multiplication wasn't a division but an expansion. Each cub was the whole cub, just as each spiral tree was the whole tree. They existed in a state of quantum entanglement that the physics hadn't yet discovered, connected across space and time in ways that made distance irrelevant. Through their cubs, the bridge children could communicate instantly, share experiences, and support each other regardless of physical separation. The woman appeared one last time to explain what had happened. The cub's choice to stay and transform was unprecedented in the long history of its kind. Usually, they chose one path or the other, physical or spiritual, but this cub had found a third way. It had become a new kind of being, one that could teach humanity about the unity that underlies apparent separation. She said this was a sign that the convergence was closer than expected, and would be more profound than anyone had imagined. Winter brought new challenges. As more people became aware of the gardens and the changes happening in the world, resistance began to organize. There were those who saw the return of magic as a threat to their understanding of reality, their control over their lives. They formed groups dedicated to exposing the hoax or protecting humanity from delusion. Some were simply scared, others were angry, and a few were dangerous in their determination to stop what they couldn't understand. The building became a target for protesters who couldn't see the garden but knew something was happening there. They held signs declaring the residents delusional or worse. Some tried to break in to prove that there was nothing special about the place. But the building protected itself in subtle ways. Doors wouldn't open for those who came with harmful intent. Elevators would mysteriously break down. Security cameras would malfunction in just the right way to prevent intrusion without causing harm. Ethan and the others realized they needed to be more careful, but also more open. Hiding would only fuel fear and suspicion. So they began holding open houses, inviting skeptics to come and see for themselves. Most saw nothing unusual, just a normal building with perhaps unusually happy residents. But occasionally, someone would pause, their expression changing from skepticism to wonder as they caught a glimpse of something more. These converts often became the strongest advocates for acceptance and understanding. During this time, Lily began showing new abilities that concerned and amazed Ethan in equal measure. She could step sideways out of reality, disappearing from one place and appearing in another without crossing the space between. She could speak to the consciousness of the building itself, asking it to create or change spaces as needed. Most remarkably, she could show people their own magical potential, awakening abilities they didn't know they had. This last gift proved to be both blessing and burden. Some people were thrilled to discover they could do things they'd only dreamed of. Others were terrified by the implications, by the responsibility that came with power. Lily learned to be more careful, to sense who was ready for awakening and who needed more time to prepare. She was growing up too fast, Ethan thought, carrying wisdom that should take decades to accumulate. Spring arrived with an explosion of growth that extended far beyond the garden. Plants throughout the city began behaving strangely, growing in patterns that spelled out messages in languages both ancient and new. Animals started showing signs of enhanced intelligence, not human level, but something more. A kind of collective awareness that allowed them to work together in unprecedented ways. The boundary between natural and supernatural was dissolving, revealing that they had never been separate categories at all. The spiral tree began to pulse with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the earth itself. Those who touched it reported visions of the future, not fixed prophecies but possibilities that shifted based on present choices. They saw cities where buildings grew like living things, where technology and magic had merged into something neither and both. They saw children who could reshape reality with their imagination, but who used this power with wisdom and restraint. They saw a world where wonder was as common as breathing, but never taken for granted. One day, a delegation arrived at the building. They were government officials, scientists, and military personnel who had been tracking the anomalies and had finally traced them to their source. They came prepared for anything from mass delusion to alien invasion. What they found was Ethan and a group of parents and children having a picnic in the courtyard, looking perfectly normal except for the unusual happiness that radiated from them. The lead official, a stern woman named Director Sarah Chen, demanded answers. She had footage, readings, testimonies that couldn't be explained. Ethan made a decision that would change everything. He invited her to the garden. Not the others in her delegation, not yet, just her. Something in her eyes, a hunger that went beyond professional curiosity, told him she was ready. The journey to the 7th floor and up the hidden stairs was silent. Director Chen's expression shifted from skepticism to confusion to awe as they climbed. When they emerged in the garden, she stood frozen for a full minute, her trained mind trying to process what her eyes were seeing. The cub approached her slowly, carefully, and when it nuzzled her hand, she broke down, crying, years of rigid control crumbling in the face of pure wonder. She spent hours in the garden, asking questions, taking notes that transformed into poetry without her conscious intent. When she finally left, she was changed. She returned to her superiors with a report that said the anomalies were real, but harmless, beneficial even. She recommended observation without interference, protection without control. She became a secret ally, helping to deflect more aggressive investigations while privately visiting the garden to heal from wounds she hadn't known she carried. As summer approached, the convergence accelerated. Gardens were appearing spontaneously now, not just in buildings but in forests, deserts, underwater, even in clouds. The network had reached critical mass, and reality itself was beginning to restructure around the new paradigm. Scientists were baffled as physical laws seemed to become more flexible, more responsive to consciousness and intent. The children who had been visiting the garden were now teenagers and young adults, though the newer children continued to arrive. Each generation was more naturally attuned to the magic, needing less training and adjustment. Lily, now 5, was teaching children twice her age, her understanding of the bridge between worlds intuitive and complete. She and her cub had become so synchronized that they often moved as one being with 2 bodies. One significant development was the emergence of what they called the Council of Gardens. Representatives from gardens around the world would meet in a space that existed between all gardens, a neutral ground where decisions affecting the network could be discussed. Ethan was surprised to find himself appointed as one of the council members, his role as chronicler giving him a unique perspective on the changes occurring. The council faced its first major challenge when a garden in Berlin was discovered by a group that wanted to exploit it for profit. They had found ways to harvest the magical plants and bottle the water from healing springs, selling them to the wealthy as miracle cures. The garden was dying, its magic being drained faster than it could regenerate. The council had to decide whether to intervene directly, risking exposure, or find another way. Lily proposed a solution that demonstrated wisdom beyond her years. Instead of fighting, they would teach. The exploiters were motivated by greed, yes, but also by a recognition of value. If they could be shown that the garden's true worth lay not in what could be taken from it, but in what it could teach, they might become protectors instead of destroyers. It was a risk, but the council agreed to try. A delegation of bridge children visited the Berlin Garden's exploiters. They didn't threaten or lecture. They simply showed them what they were really destroying. They revealed the connections between all living things, the delicate balance that the gardens maintained, the future that was possible if the magic was nurtured rather than consumed. Most importantly, they awakened the latent magical abilities in the exploiters themselves, showing them they could be part of something magnificent rather than just profiting from it. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete, but it began. The company that had been exploiting the garden became its guardian, using its resources to protect and nurture rather than extract and sell. They became a model for how corporate power could be aligned with magical preservation, creating a template that would be replicated around the world. As autumn returned, marking 2 years since the transformation of the cub, the world was notably different. Magic was no longer hidden, though not everyone could see it clearly. It had become like music, something that existed whether you could hear it or not, enriching the lives of those who learned to listen. The news had stopped calling them anomalies and started calling them possibilities. Scientists had begun developing new theories that incorporated consciousness as a fundamental force. The building on Maple Street had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, though most visitors didn't know exactly why they felt drawn there. They would walk through the lobby, maybe have coffee in the courtyard, and leave feeling lighter, more hopeful, more connected to something larger than themselves. The residents had learned to be subtle guides, dropping hints and suggestions that might lead the ready ones to discover the door on the 7th floor. Ethan's journal had grown into multiple volumes, each one containing not just words, but experiences that readers could feel and almost live. Other chroniclers around the world were creating similar records, building a library of transformation that would serve as both history and instruction manual for future generations. The woman had been right. These stories were important, not just as records but as active agents of change. One winter evening, as snow fell upward in the garden and the children built sculptures from starlight, the cub brought a message. The mother of all cubs was preparing for something called the Great Opening. It would be the moment when the barriers between worlds became not just thin, but permeable, when anyone who chose to could step between realities as easily as walking through a door. It wouldn't be forced on anyone, but the option would be there, available to all who were ready. The preparation for the Great Opening required all the gardens to work in harmony. Each one began to pulse with the same rhythm, creating a planetary heartbeat that could be felt by sensitive individuals everywhere. The spiral trees grew taller, their branches interweaving across dimensions to create a canopy of connection that spanned the globe. The cubs, in all their forms, began to sing a song that had no words but conveyed meaning directly to the soul. During this time, Lily experienced what she called the dreaming. For 3 days and nights, she slept a sleep that couldn't be broken, though her body remained healthy and her breathing steady. In her dreams, she traveled to every garden in the network, meeting every bridge child, learning every variation of the magic they were nurturing. When she woke, she had aged not in years, but in understanding. She spoke of the responsibility they carried, not as burden, but as privilege, to help humanity through its metamorphosis. She shared visions of what was coming. The great opening wouldn't be a single event, but a process, like a flower blooming in slow motion. Some people would step through immediately, eager for adventure and expansion. Others would take years or decades, approaching slowly, carefully, at their own pace, and some would choose never to cross, remaining in the familiar world while benefiting from the enrichment that the open doors would bring. The key, she said, was that it would be a choice. No one would be forced to acknowledge or interact with the magic, but it would be there, available, waiting, patient as the gardens themselves. The world would become larger without losing its familiar aspects. Science and magic would dance together, each informing and enriching the other. Children would grow up bilingual in reality, equally comfortable with computers and cubs, mathematics and mystery. As spring arrived once more, the preparations intensified. The garden on the rooftop had become a command center of sorts, coordinating with gardens worldwide to ensure the opening happened smoothly. The risk wasn't in the magic itself, but in human reaction to it. Fear could cause chaos. Misunderstanding could lead to conflict. So they worked to prepare humanity gradually, through dreams and art and small miracles that opened minds without overwhelming them. Ethan found himself traveling more, not just to other gardens, but to speak at conferences and gatherings where open-minded individuals were trying to understand the changes. He never proselytized or tried to convince skeptics. He simply told stories, shared experiences, and let people draw their own conclusions. Many dismissed him as a creative writer with an overactive imagination, but some recognized truth when they heard it, and these became seeds of understanding in their communities. The resistance hadn't disappeared, but had evolved. Instead of trying to stop the magic, some groups were trying to control it, to weaponize it or monopolize it for their own purposes. The council had to develop protective measures, ways to ensure that the gardens and the bridge children couldn't be exploited or harmed. This led to the development of what they called the Accord, a set of principles that governed how magic could and couldn't be used. The Accord wasn't enforced by any external authority, but by the magic itself. Those who tried to use it for harm found it simply wouldn't respond. Those who attempted to hoard it discovered it would slip away like water through grasping fingers. The magic had its own intelligence, or perhaps it responded to the collective consciousness of all who were connected to it. Either way, it protected itself and those who served it. One day, in early summer, something unprecedented happened. A child was born in the garden itself, not brought there, but actually born among the spiral tree's roots. The mother was a bridge child who had grown up in the network, and the father was what the woman had called a star walker, someone who could travel between planets as easily as between rooms. The baby was something new, a being native to both worlds simultaneously, without need for bridges because she was the bridge. This child, whom they named Aurora, grew at an unusual rate, aging a year and a month, then slowing to normal time when she reached the developmental stage of a 5-year-old. She could speak from birth, but in a language that bypassed words entirely, communicating in pure meaning and emotion. When she looked at someone, she saw not just their present but their potential, all the possible versions of themselves they could become. Aurora's presence accelerated the opening. Reality seemed to reorganize itself around her, becoming more fluid, more responsive to consciousness. Where she walked, flowers bloomed out of season. When she laughed, the air shimmered with colors that didn't have names. When she cried, which was rare, rain would fall upward, returning water to the clouds to be purified and renewed. Lily and Aurora became inseparable, two aspects of the same purpose. Where Lily was the teacher and guide, Aurora was the catalyst and transformer. Together with their cubs, which had begun to merge and separate in increasingly complex patterns, they represented the future of humanity. A future where the boundaries between self and other, human and nature, matter and consciousness, were understood to be useful illusions rather than absolute truths. The summer solstice brought the beginning of the Great Opening. It started subtly, with sensitive individuals around the world reporting the same dream. They stood before doors that hadn't been there before, doors that led to gardens, forests, oceans of possibility. Some opened these doors in their dreams and woke to find their lives subtly transformed. Others hesitated, needing more time to prepare, and the doors waited patiently for them. In the physical world, the changes were equally subtle at first. Colors became more vivid. Music carried emotions more clearly. The wind began to whisper in languages that some could almost understand. Animals showed increased intelligence and empathy. Plants grew in patterns that suggested intention and communication. The world was waking up, or perhaps humanity was waking up to the world that had always been awake. The garden on the rooftop became a beacon, visible from space to those who knew how to look. Astronauts reported seeing a light that shouldn't be there, a glow that seemed to pulse with life and intention. Satellites registered energy readings that didn't match any known phenomenon. The world's governments quietly formed a joint task force to study what they called the Maple Street phenomenon, though by now it was clear that Maple Street was just one node in a global network. Director Chen, who had become a regular visitor to the garden, served as liaison between the magical and mundane authorities. She helped establish protocols for interaction, ensuring that neither side felt threatened by the other. She also began recruiting others in positions of power who showed signs of readiness, gradually building a network of protectors within the system itself. As autumn approached, the opening accelerated. Gardens began appearing in public spaces. Not hidden, but simply unnoticed by those who weren't ready to see them. Children would disappear into patches of ordinary-looking bushes and emerge hours later with stories of adventures in lands that couldn't possibly exist. Artists found themselves creating works that seemed to have lives of their own. Paintings that moved, sculptures that sang, poems that rewrote themselves to match the reader's need. The cubs, in all their myriad forms, began to appear more openly. They would walk through cities in broad daylight, visible to some, invisible to others, leaving trails of transformation in their wake. Where they passed, people would suddenly remember dreams they'd forgotten, or feel compelled to help strangers, or find themselves humming songs in languages they didn't know they knew. One particularly significant event occurred when a cub appeared on live television during a news broadcast. Half the viewers saw nothing unusual, just a strange shadow or trick of the light. The other half saw a magnificent creature of light and possibility walk through the studio, pause to look directly at the camera, and then step through the wall as if it wasn't there. The footage went viral, sparking debates that raged for weeks. Was it real? Was it a hoax? Was it a mass hallucination? The fact that people couldn't even agree on what they'd seen only added to the mystery. Ethan watched all of this with a mixture of joy and concern. The opening was happening faster than anyone had anticipated, and not everyone was handling it well. There were reports of people becoming lost in their own imaginations, unable to distinguish between the magical and the mundane. Others were so frightened by the changes that they retreated into rigid denial, refusing to acknowledge anything outside their previous understanding of reality. The council convened an emergency meeting in the space between gardens. Representatives from around the world gathered to discuss how to manage the transition more smoothly. Some argued for slowing the opening, giving humanity more time to adjust. Others felt that the momentum couldn't and shouldn't be stopped, that those who were struggling would find their balance in time. Aurora, despite being physically only a few months old but developmentally a child, offered the wisdom that changed their approach. She suggested that instead of trying to control the pace of the opening, they should focus on creating support systems for those who were struggling. Every garden should become not just a place of magic, but a place of healing and integration. They would train guides who could help people navigate the expansion of reality without losing themselves. They would create safe spaces where the frightened could approach magic gradually, at their own pace, with support and understanding. This approach proved successful. Gardens began offering what they called integration circles, where people could share their experiences, fears, and wonders without judgment. Those who had adjusted well helped those who were struggling. Children taught adults how to play with reality without trying to control it. The elderly shared wisdom about other times of great change and how humanity had survived them. Winter arrived with a surprise. The spiral trees in every garden simultaneously bloomed with flowers made of ice and fire, impossible blossoms that gave off light without heat, cold without freezing. Each flower contained a seed, and these seeds, when planted in the regular world, grew into small versions of the spiral trees. Not everyone could see them, but they were there, spreading the network beyond the gardens, into homes and schools and offices. Lily and Aurora, working together, discovered they could use these new trees to create what they called soft gardens, spaces that weren't fully magical, but weren't entirely mundane either. These served as transition zones where people could experience magic in small, manageable doses. A soft garden might be a corner of a library where books would occasionally recommend themselves, or a park bench where sitting would bring profound peace and clarity. The cubs adapted to this new phase by becoming even more varied in their forms. Some became nearly invisible, existing as gentle presences that offered comfort without being seen. Others became more solid and present, serving as visible bridges for those who needed tangible proof of magic. Each cub matched itself to the needs of the humans around it, shape-shifting not just in form but in degree of reality. As the year drew to a close, Ethan realized that his role as chronicler had evolved. He was no longer just recording events but helping to shape them through the act of observation and documentation. His journals had become living documents that changed based on who was reading them and what they needed to understand. Words would rearrange themselves, new chapters would appear, and sometimes readers would find messages written specifically for them in handwriting they didn't recognize, but somehow trusted. The building on Maple Street had transformed beyond recognition, though it still looked the same from the outside to casual observers. Inside, it had become a multidimensional space where apartments could be bigger on the inside, where hallways led to different places depending on your intention, where the basement connected to caves that existed under every city simultaneously. It had become not just a building, but a living being, conscious and caring, protecting its residents while serving as a gateway for those ready to explore larger realities. The great opening was no longer approaching, it was happening, had been happening, would continue happening. Time itself had become more fluid around the gardens, with past, present, and future overlapping in ways that linear thinking couldn't quite grasp. Children who wouldn't be born for years were already visiting the gardens in dreams. Elderly people were meeting their younger selves and sharing wisdom across decades. The cubs moved through time as easily as through space, delivering messages and maintaining connections across all moments simultaneously. One spring morning, exactly 3 years after Ethan had found the cub in the mailbox, he stood in the garden with Lily, Aurora, and all the friends who had become family through their shared journey. The sun was rising, but it was also setting, and also at zenith all at once. The garden showed all its seasons simultaneously, snow and flowers, falling leaves and new growth existing in perfect harmony. The cubs, in all their forms, had gathered for what they called a celebration of becoming. The woman appeared, not as she had before, but in her true form, which was every form and no form, ancient and newly born, vast and intimate. She spoke to them all, not in words, but in direct knowing. She told them that the work they had done, the bridges they had built, the gardens they had tended, had succeeded beyond the wildest hopes of those who had planned this moment across millennia. Humanity was remembering its magical nature, not abandoning its scientific achievements but enriching them with wonder and possibility. She revealed that this had always been the plan, that the forgetting had been necessary for humanity to develop certain strengths and abilities, but now it was time to remember and integrate. The children, being born now, would grow up in a world where magic and technology, spirit and matter, imagination and reality were understood as different faces of the same infinite crystal of existence. They would solve problems that previous generations couldn't even conceptualize, not through force or control, but through harmony and understanding. The cub that had started it all, the one that had been stuck in the mailbox, appeared in its original form one last time. It had grown beyond physical form, but could still manifest when needed. It approached Ethan and Lily with obvious affection, and in a moment of perfect communication, it thanked them. Not just for freeing it from the mailbox, but for freeing the world from the limitation of single-dimensional thinking. Their act of unconditional help that morning had been the key that unlocked everything that followed. As the celebration continued, more people arrived, some walking through doors, others simply appearing, many not even sure how they'd gotten there. The garden expanded to accommodate everyone, becoming as large as it needed to be. There were people from every culture, every age, every walk of life, all united by their readiness to embrace a larger reality. They shared food that tasted like memories, drank water that carried the songs of distant stars, and danced to music that created itself from the joy of the moment. Children played games that rewrote the rules of physics temporarily. Adults discussed philosophy with beings that existed as pure thought. Artists collaborated with the cubs to create works that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Scientists compared notes with mystics and found they'd been studying the same phenomena from different angles. The divisions that had seemed so important in the mundane world dissolved in the face of shared wonder. As night fell, or perhaps as another day began, or perhaps in that eternal moment that exists outside of time, Ethan found himself standing with Lily at the edge of the garden, looking out over the city. But it wasn't just their city anymore. Through the garden's expanded perception, they could see every city, every garden, every point of light in the vast network that now encompassed the earth and was beginning to reach beyond. Lily, now 6 years old in linear time but ancient in wisdom, took her father's hand. She told him that this was just the beginning, that humanity's journey into its fuller potential would take generations to complete. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt, but the foundation had been laid, the doors had been opened, and there was no going back to the narrow reality of before. The cubs would continue to guide, The gardens would continue to grow, and children like her and Aurora would help humanity navigate its transformation. She pointed to the stars, which seemed closer than ever before, and told him that Earth's opening was part of something even larger. Other worlds were going through similar transformations, and eventually the networks would connect, creating a web of consciousness and possibility that spanned the universe. The cub's mother was one of many such beings, gardeners of reality who helped species evolve from isolation to connection, from limitation to possibility. But that was for the future. For now, there was this moment, this garden, this impossible, wonderful reality where a bare cub getting stuck in a mailbox had changed the course of human history. Ethan laughed at the absurdity and profundity of it all. He pulled out his journal to write about the celebration, but found that the words were already there, written in handwriting that was his and not his, telling a story that was ending and beginning, complete and ongoing. The celebration continued through the night or day or timeless moment. People came and went, some staying for what felt like minutes, others for what felt like years, though no time passed at all in the mundane world. Each person took something with them when they left, a seed of possibility, a memory of wonder, a connection to the larger reality that would grow and flourish in their daily lives. As dawn broke, or perhaps as it always was breaking, the garden began to settle into a new configuration. The celebration didn't end, but transformed into something quieter, more sustainable. The gardens worldwide synchronized into a rhythm that matched the Earth's heartbeat, the solar system's dance, the galaxy's spin. The great opening had become the new normal, though normal was no longer a word that meant what it used to mean. Ethan and Lily returned to their apartment, though return wasn't quite accurate since they'd never really left and had always been on their way back. The cub was there, all the cubs were there, existing in a state of quantum superposition that made perfect sense if you didn't think about it too hard. Aurora was there too, aged another year in the hours of the celebration, now appearing as a 7-year-old with eyes that held the wisdom of ages. They sat together in the living room that was also a forest clearing, a library, a star chamber, depending on how you looked at it. Outside the window, the city went about its business, most people unaware that reality had fundamentally changed. Though they might notice that colors were brighter, that synchronicities were more common, that dreams were more vivid and meaningful. The mailbox in the lobby had become a shrine of sorts, though most people didn't consciously realize it. They would pause there without knowing why, touch it gently, leave small offerings of flowers or coins or origami cranes. Sometimes, late at night or early in the morning, another cub would be found there, not stuck, but waiting, ready to begin another chapter in the ever-expanding story of humanity's awakening. Ethan's journal had grown beyond any physical book, becoming a living narrative that existed in the network itself, accessible to anyone who needed to understand their own part in the larger story. Other chroniclers' works had merged with it, creating a vast library of transformation that would guide future generations through their own openings, their own discoveries, their own contributions to the growing web of wonder. The government task force studying the Maple Street phenomenon had quietly disbanded, its members either converted to protectors of the magic or convinced that there was nothing to study, their memories gently edited by the network to prevent harmful interference. Director Chen had become something more than human, less than magical. A perfect bridge between worlds who helped maintain the delicate balance as humanity adjusted to its new reality. Schools began to change, slowly and subtly. Children would come home talking about lessons that weren't in any curriculum, about teachers who might or might not have been there, about classrooms that definitely hadn't existed the day before. parents who were connected to the network understood and supported these changes. Others simply noticed that their children were happier, more creative, more engaged with learning. The soft gardens Lily and Aurora had created were multiplying exponentially. Every neighborhood had at least one, though not everyone could see them. They served as gentle introduction points for those beginning to awaken, safe spaces where magic couldn't overwhelm and mundane couldn't suppress. In these spaces, small miracles were common. Lost things were found, broken hearts began to heal, and impossible solutions to ordinary problems presented themselves. The Cubs had become so integrated into the fabric of reality that most people didn't even notice them anymore, at least not consciously. They would feel a presence of comfort when sad, a nudge of inspiration when stuck, a moment of joy for no apparent reason. The Cubs had learned to exist in the spaces between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats, always present but never intrusive. As summer returned once more, the garden showed them visions of what was to come. Cities would grow into living beings, conscious and caring for their inhabitants. Technology would evolve to work with consciousness rather than despite it. Art and science would merge into something neither and both. Children would be born who could paint with starlight, compose symphonies of gravity, and write equations that described love as accurately as they described motion. But more importantly, humanity would remember how to be human in the fullest sense. The divisions between self and other would soften without disappearing. People would maintain their individuality while recognizing their fundamental connection. Competition would transform into collaboration, scarcity into abundance, fear into curiosity. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't happen without effort, but the potential was there, activated and growing. The woman appeared one final time to tell them that her work here was complete. The gardens were self-sustaining now, the network strong enough to maintain itself. The bridge children had become bridge adults who were teaching the next generation. The Cubs had evolved into something that transcended their original purpose, becoming permanent fixtures of the new reality. She was needed elsewhere, in other worlds, going through their own openings. Before she left, she revealed one last secret. The building on Maple Street, the garden on its roof, the cub in the mailbox, none of it had been random. Ethan and Lily had been chosen before they were born, their souls agreeing to play these roles in humanity's transformation. Every person who had found their way to the garden had made similar agreements, choosing to be pioneers in the expansion of human consciousness. But choice, she emphasized, was always paramount. They could have walked past the mailbox that morning. They could have called animal control. They could have never followed the cub to the roof. At every moment they had chosen wonder over fear, connection over isolation, love over indifference. And those choices, multiplied across millions of small moments and thousands of people, had changed everything. As she faded into the light between atoms, she left them with a final gift: the ability to see the choices, the infinite branching paths that extended from every moment. Not to control or predict, but to understand the profound power of each decision, each action, each thought. With this sight came responsibility, but also freedom, the knowledge that every moment was an opportunity to choose wonder, to nurture magic, to build bridges. Life continued in the building on Maple Street, ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. Ethan still went to work, though his job had evolved into something that hadn't existed before, helping organizations integrate magical thinking into their structures. Lily went to school, though she spent as much time teaching as learning, helping her classmates discover their own connections to the network. Aurora aged at her own pace, sometimes a child, sometimes ancient, always exactly what the moment needed. The garden remained constant and ever-changing, a beacon for those ready to expand their reality. New people found it every day, each one adding their own thread to the tapestry of transformation. Some stayed for minutes, some for lifetimes, all leaving changed in ways they might not fully understand for years. The spiral tree grew ever taller, its branches reaching into dimensions that didn't have names, its roots deepening into the foundation of existence itself. And in the lobby, the mailbox stood unchanged, a monument to the morning when everything shifted. Occasionally, very occasionally, another cub would appear there, not stuck but waiting, ready to test the next person who needed to discover that helping something small and vulnerable could open doors to infinite possibility. Each time it happened, the network grew stronger, the magic spread further, and humanity took another step toward remembering what it had always been capable of becoming. The story that began with a baby seeing a bear cub stuck in a mailbox had become something beyond any single narrative. It was now part of the larger story of human evolution, of consciousness expanding, of reality revealing its true nature as something far more flexible and responsive than anyone had dared to imagine. And it was still just the beginning. The great opening had become the great continuing, an endless unfolding of possibility that would carry humanity into futures that couldn't be imagined, because they would be created by imaginations that didn't yet exist.